This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Claudia Day, and in this new series, I'm delighted to introduce you to expert coaches and thought leaders who share their passion for generating self-awareness through insight tools. Our aim is to inspire and explore with you some of the most impactful tools available to us coaches and leaders. Hi, everybody, and welcome today to Philippe Rosinski, award-winning coach, best-selling author, professor, who is here with us today. And I will let you introduce yourself, Philippe.
Hello, Claudia. I'm pleased to be with you. What could I say? You want a long version, short version? Maybe what I can say is that I've been coaching for over 30 years. I started, in fact, as an engineer, working as an engineer. My first job was in the Silicon Valley, and working as an engineer and then as a manager, I realized that a lot more could be done to ensure we could make the best use of people's potential. And that was the beginning of a long journey. Eventually, I started to work as a consultant trainer, and I started to do something that happened to be coaching. And that was over 30 years ago in Belgium. Then I realized a lot had been done in the area of coaching already. I connected with several people around the world, and I've started my own company 25 years ago to promote a more integrated and a more intercultural approach to coaching. And today I have the privileges of working as an executive coach, as a team coach, leadership development trainer. I'm also a professor in a business school in Japan. I intervene in other academic institutions, and I've also trained many intercultural coaches around the world. I guess that's what I could say for now.
Great. And today we will also be covering some of the framework you developed, which is cultural orientation framework. So to get us started, it would be great to hear your definition of culture and what you chose your work to be based on.
The definition I propose for culture is the characteristics of one group that would distinguish this group from another group. And what this means is several things. First of all, this suggests that we belong to several groups at the same time. So we don't have just one culture, we have multiple cultures. I think that's an important point because in traditional interculturalism, the emphasis has been on national differences. And when people talk about their culture, they often refer to their national cultures. And many books comparing, let's say, the French versus the Brits versus the Japanese, the Chinese. For sure, there are some national differences, but we belong to several cultures, and it's not enough to just focus on national differences. There are many differences within a country. For example, if you take Japan, I've heard many young Japanese telling me that they feel closer to the Western culture than to the old Japanese culture. So for sure, generational differences matters. There are also differences across companies. Each company, each organization has a certain culture. So that's also an element. So we all belong to several groups. And in fact, our behaviors will depend on the group we happen to be with at a moment in time. With some of my friends in that particular group, we will tend to tease each other. I will behave in a certain way. If I'm now in a different context, in a serious business meeting, I will behave differently. So just to say that, I think it's first of all important to recognize that we all belong to several groups. We all have multiple cultures. Then the second point, when we talk about characteristics, I've seen some people just referring to visible characteristics. They would describe visible behaviors. That's interesting, but I think it's not enough to understand a culture. But conversely, you have a definition like culture being the software of the mind, focusing on internal aspects. That's valuable too, but I think it's not enough either. I think what is interesting is to consider both the visible and the invisible aspects of culture. The visible aspects would be behaviors, products, artifacts. The invisible aspects would be norms, values, basic assumptions. It's all connected. And if we want to appreciate, understand cultures, I think we need to look at both aspects and the interplay of all these aspects. So that's my definition of culture. And just hopefully that gives you a little bit of sense of what this implies.
Do you have any idea, just out of curiosity, I suddenly wondered what an average person, how many groups an average person has?
It's difficult to say because it all depends on how you define your group. Your family is also a group, so we hopefully all have a family. Our school is a group. Our company, if we work in a certain organization, it's also a group. But within that organization, you may be in a certain division, part of that organization. So there is also a culture there. So I don't know that we can set a specific number, but what we want is to be able to characterize groups that happen to matter for that particular individual and to focus on similarities and differences that we want to consider. For example, in a case of a merger acquisitions between companies, our focus will be on comparing the two company cultures, for example. But in other situations, maybe our focus will be on comparing generational differences. That would be my answer to not having a specific answer because it all depends on how you define the notion of group.
Yeah. So we go collecting almost groups, and amazing to think how many groups we are part of when you start thinking about it, because we go around life without really thinking which groups we are part of or seeing them as a group.
Claudia, in fact, maybe I should add something. We'll talk in a moment about the COF, the COF, the Cultural Orientation Framework Assessment. This tool gives you the possibility to define subgroups in a customized fashion. So that's part of the reflection when you set up the assessment, is to reflect on what it is that I want to focus on beyond those three standard groups that will be automatically considered, but what else do we want to consider? And so the tool will then allow you to create subgroup profiles based on the subgroups that you will have defined.
Yeah. And then there is, of course, my own culture.
Yes. Our culture, in fact, we have multiple cultures, but what happens is that maybe we should add another definition, and that's the concept of cultural identity. And I would describe this as the dynamic synthesis of our cultures. What this means is that at any moment in time, we belong to several groups, but some cultural aspects may come to the fore, while others more go to the background. Maybe when you are with your family, certain values will come to the fore. When you are at work, other values may come to the fore. Maybe those values are different. And so depending on the context, something will be more important in one context and something else will be important in another context. But sometimes those values may be the same and they just reinforce each other.
In following that, how is it important for us? Why is it important for us to have cultural awareness?
It's important because if we don't have cultural awareness, what will tend to happen is that we have a certain worldview, and the risk is that this worldview will become central to all reality for us. Everything is examined through that cultural prism that we have. Our values, our beliefs, our norms, everything is evaluated through that prism. So what happens when we work with people from other cultures? The risk is that we may either consider that our culture is superior to their culture, or we may minimize the cultural differences between our respective cultures. If we want to be able to work across cultures, we don't need to give up our cultural preferences. We don't need to give up our cultural view, but we want to appreciate that other people may have a different worldview, and that worldview can also be legitimate, can also be interesting. Let me give a concrete example. If in my worldview, it's important to be direct in my communication, it's important for me to be straightforward, to say what I mean, to mean what I say, I can now appreciate that maybe in a different culture, indirect communication may have some merits, because indirect communication is where you want to make sure you don't offend anybody. Nobody lose face. So you are able to preserve some harmony. I don't need to give up my preference for clarity in communication, but I can now appreciate that there is a value also in maintaining harmony, in ensuring nobody is going to be offended. I can better appreciate that if I'm open to the fact that there is another worldview that is legitimate. I can then also learn to adapt to that other culture, to shift, to flex my style of communication so I'm able to work with somebody from a different culture. And eventually I may have an attitude of wanting to make the most of differences, to ask myself, what can I learn from these other cultures so I can become a better coach, a better human being? And I just expand my behavioral options. So one reason would be to be able to work with other people. But the more fundamental reason, I would argue, is that it's a more creative and complete approach to coaching when we have this understanding of cultural differences. Why am I saying this? Is we all have our biases, and that's okay. But sometimes those cultural biases that we have can be limiting. And if we are open to learn from different cultures, what happens is that we can go beyond these limitations. We can now consider other ways of thinking, other ways of communicating, other ways of organizing ourselves. In other words, we just have more options available to act as a leader, as a human being, and as a coach. And we can become more creative in the sense of being able to address our difficult challenges by considering alternative cultural perspectives to be able to address this in a different way. So those are the two goals.
So starting by understanding ourselves and then working on our abilities to also flex our own style for our growth and development, which in the cultural orientations framework, you provide this. Can we maybe go more into detail about, or can you walk us through the fundamentals of the cultural orientations framework so that we can bring it to life here?
Yes, this tool builds upon the work of many interculturalists, Talcott Parsons in the 1950s, Gluckon and Schrottberg, Hofstede, Edward Hall, and some others. And there are 17 dimensions in the model, grouped in 7 categories. The categories include how we communicate, how we think, how we organize ourselves, how we manage time, what is our sense of identity and purpose, of power and responsibility. I think the idea is that it's interesting to be aware of variations that exist in all these areas. And the COF stands for Cultural Orientation Framework, just provides us with a vocabulary, a roadmap to navigate the cultural terrain. So if we want, we can go into more details to give some examples of what those dimensions could be, but that's the idea. It's to really provide us with a vocabulary, a roadmap to navigate that cultural terrain. And the assessment is looking at 2 aspects. One is, what are our preferences, our orientations? Let me give an example. The first dimension, control versus humility. This relates to a philosophical question. Are we in charge of our destiny, or is it mainly a question of luck and fate? Different cultures have different beliefs around that. So control, if I have a cultural preference for control, that means I tend to believe that life is what you make of it. Yes, we can. Or remember Tony Robbins and his book, Unlimited Power. So that's the idea that we have all the power. If we work hard, we persevere, we can achieve anything. So that would be one perspective. The other perspective, humility, I call this humility. On the other end of the spectrum is this idea that it's mainly a question of luck and fate, that we don't have much control about what happens to us. It's a question of luck and fate. So maybe I should say a few words about how to use the tool. The goal here is to understand that there is merit in both the perspectives. With control, the good news is that this tends to make us more proactive. We believe that we are in charge, where we are more likely to put things in motions, and maybe ultimately we are ending up achieving amazing success even against all odds, because there is this phenomena called the self-fulfilling prophecy. If I believe I can do it, I'm more likely to put everything in place and then achieve amazing success. The problem, though, with this belief is that, I don't know about you, Claudia, but in my experience, we do not have all the power. And if I don't see that, the risk is that I will go beyond my limitations. I may end up cheating. I may end up with some burnout. I may go beyond my own limitation and push others beyond their limitations as well. I think I'm serving them, but in fact, I'm pushing them beyond their limitations because I fail to see these limitations. We can achieve it all. That's my belief. The other perspective, humility, is an invitation for us to consider our limitations, to accept our limitations, to let go. If we take this literally, we are in trouble because we might as well stop doing any work because we consider that it doesn't depend on us. It's a question of fate and luck whether we will succeed or not. But there is wisdom in this view of humility. And the wisdom is that it leads us to accept our limitations, to let go of what is beyond our control. And the way to use the tool is not to consider that one is right and the other is wrong, but to find ways to consider at the same time both perspectives. How can I act with a lot of determination as if I had all the power, while at the same time recognizing that not everything is in my hands? So letting go of what is beyond my control. If we are able to combine the two perspectives, we can achieve a more sustainable form of success. That's just for the first dimension. There are 17 dimensions like that allow us to explore the cultural landscape and reflect on, hey, where do we stand? And what may be limiting for us? What may be our blind spots? What may be our opportunities to grow?
Yeah, and taking every situation, so focusing a lot on the situation and what the situation needs. Does the situation need me to let go, or does the situation need me to work harder on this goal and adopt a mentality of I can do it?
And Claudia, if I may say, but the thing is, it's not one or the other. Sometimes the paradox is when I let go, that's when I can achieve more. And the philosophy here, which is also a bit unusual because in many instances, we tend to think in terms of or, a binary form of thinking. It's either this or that, and we need to find some form of balance. Here, what I'm promoting is the concept of leveraging the differences, the paradox. When I let go, that's when I can achieve more. When I slow down, that's when I can better appreciate the scarcity of time, and so on and so forth. How can we replace a zero-sum game, more of one meaning less of the other, with a positive sum game, paradoxically achieving more of both polarities? That's a form of thinking that is more complex, more paradoxical, but that is needed if we want to promote unity in diversity. Unity in diversity that is a mutual enrichment, which is different from uniformity, which would be a blunt version where we eliminate all the disparities. Here we want to promote mutual enrichment, learning from each other. That's the philosophy.
For the audience, if you found this interesting, we are going to continue to explore the other domains. But before we continue, maybe you can stop now. And there is on the notes some instructions on how to complete your own profile. And so this way you can then come back and listen already seeing yours and relating to it a bit more. For me, this was very insightful because, for example, I came high on control. And at the moment, I'm in a stage in my life where I can learn of letting go a bit more. And I'm reading the book. I also read the book, and it's almost like philosophical and making you think about how others do it in the world and how we can apply this. So I invite you all to go and fill out the survey and then come back and continue listening. So, Philippe, now that the audience has more awareness, do you want to go in exploring the other ones in more detail?
The other ones, meaning the other dimensions?
The other dimensions, yes.
Yes, I could go on for a long time describing 17 dimensions in the model. But so if you want, I can go over some of those. But what I would suggest is for those who are interested in examining their reports, I would refer to what you just said, Claudia, to the book Coaching Across Cultures, where there is a description, a chapter devoted for each of the categories. So one chapter is on communication, one chapter is on thinking, one chapter is on different ways of organizing ourselves. And each chapter gives many examples of not only what the orientations look like, concrete examples of using that in organizations, but also the concept of leveraging differences. What would that look like? And in the book, I'm giving several examples of individuals and teams I've coached and how I've applied this concept. So maybe we can go over some of the dimensions, Claudia, and you tell me the ones that intrigue you or you think would be worth discussing.
Let's start going with them and see how many we can cover.
All right.
The next one, of course, is identity and purpose.
There was time as well, huh? The time is the second one.
That's right. There's time as a second. So time management. Time management. So let's go with time management.
Okay. I find that's one area where many people struggle indeed. The first dimension there is scarce time versus plentiful time. And many people, there is this idea that time is scarce. There is never enough time to do all the things we need to do. If that's what we believe, we tend to become very productive, very efficient. And that's great. But the danger is that when we become very productive, efficient, we may end up doing more and more things, and we may end up being overwhelmed. There is another perspective. Time is plentiful. If I believe that time is plentiful, I can slow down, I can take the time. And paradoxically, when I slow down, when I take the time, I may better appreciate the scarcity of time. I may be in a better position to savor each moment, to discern what is truly important. And slowing down is an opportunity to discern what matters most, to become effective in the sense of focusing on what matters, doing the right things, as opposed to just doing things right, which is about efficiency. Now, again, we can combine the two perspectives. But let me give a concrete example in coaching. It used to be that in the 90s, when I was working with teams, they would not hesitate, even senior teams, to give me 4 or 5 days for a team retreat. It seems these days that people have less and less time, particularly senior people in organizations. And so sometimes they would ask me to do some team coaching, but they only have half a day. I even had the case of they didn't have half a day. They wanted me to just come for a coffee break, to just work with them over the coffee break. I wish I was a magician and I would be able to help them in such a short amount of time. I was in control. I could do this, but I cannot. To be effective, to make an impact, I need more time with the team. So my response typically for a request like that would be to say, what do you hope to accomplish with this team coaching? And if the answer is, we hope to do this and that, and if my sense is that this is not really compelling, what I will tell to that potential client is, I recommend that you don't do any team coaching. You're so busy. Why don't go for a dinner together, share some time together, but you don't need team coaching. On the other hand, if they give me a compelling answer, if there is a lot at stake for them, then I would say I would need more of your time to be able to work with you. And so I guess what I'm saying here is that if we have this cultural awareness, there is a smaller chance that we are going to collude with the client on their worldview that time is scarce. And we are not really going to harm them by just accepting a request to do something in a short amount of time where clearly we are not going to be able to make an impact, to have an impact. So by having that awareness, we can, before we even have a contract, we can negotiate a contract that creates a condition for us to work effectively together. And teams I've worked with have ended up spending the time to step back, to reflect, to build relationships. And that investment they found was really worthwhile because just taking these few days made a big difference for them later on. The time they've wasted, so to speak, they've recuperated later on with smoother relationship, with more clarity on what they want to accomplish together. So again, just with that one dimension, there is a lot that we can do here. And that's just the second dimension on the list.
As a society, we've moved towards more of a time is scarce type of approach. Is there a culture where you have found they do better or they do more of the time is plentiful?
There are organizations still today and some of the best teams that understand that although, yes, we have a lot that we need to accomplish, that it's very important to be disciplined and to take the time to build those relationships. So my answer would be yes, in certain organizations, I'm going to start working with a client soon. And they immediately understood this and they will take the time to have a retreat, to build those relationships. So that still exists. Because even though there may be pressure from the environment to do more and more stuff in a short amount of time, it's still important for organizations to be impactful and to be effective. And for that, slowing down is not a luxury, it's mandatory. So fortunately, this still exists in several organizations. So they are able to be both efficient and effective. But if we work on autopilot, if we don't take the time to step back and reflect on what is our current cultural conditioning, we may miss this altogether. Plentiful time does exist, but it implies rather than working on autopilot, rather than just being conditioned by the pressure, the cultural pressure, this capacity, this willingness to step back, to reevaluate it. What is our current culture? What would be the culture that we need to achieve what we want to achieve? And so we become more proactive as opposed to reactive. That still exists today.
So with that coaching question, we can move on to the next one, which is identity and purpose that I wanted to jump in before. So doing versus being, and more of an individualistic versus collectivistic approach.
For the record, Claudia, I just want to mention that there are other dimensions on time, but I don't think we are going to have the time to examine them all here. Monochronic, polychronic, past, present, future. But if we talk about being and doing, what I can say about this is this has to do with, if I ask you to talk about yourself, Claudia, what are you going to talk about? Maybe you'll talk about your achievements, what you are currently doing, but maybe you might focus on how you feel, on relationships, on learning. And here, the difference is about, on the one hand, performance, and on the other hand, feelings, relationships. The two are connected. I remember one executive came to me, wanted to increase his performance, but it just happens that he was always stressed out. So the work that we did, rather than focusing on a doing type of objective, we focused more on a being type of objective, him becoming more serene, less stressed out. But by becoming more serene, that's how he was able to increase his performance. Again, the two are connected. Again, for example, you'll see this in teams as well. Team wants to have a greater performance, achieve more. But if you don't have trust within the team, if relationships are not so great within the team, if you have destructive conversations as opposed to more constructive exchanges among team members, it's unlikely that you're going to have the best performance for this team. So focusing again on the being would allow the team to increase its doing. But conversely, sometimes the emphasis is on being, relationships, and that's all good. Sometimes coaches are interested in relationship, in beings, but you still need, in an organization, the organization to be able to achieve its goals, for the organization to be able to survive and to thrive. If we have good relationship, but the organization doesn't accomplish much, it's not going to stay there. It's not going to remain successful. And the viability will not be there for people to remain in the organization. So we need to look at both aspects. If somebody tells me, I don't care about people, I just want to increase the financial performance, so more of a doing orientation, I'm not going to say to that leader, you are a bad leader, you should care about people. It's going to be more about asking them, what would it take for you to be able to achieve more? How could you engage your people in a way that they will deliver more? And again, that connection being doing.
It's amazing as you talk and as I was reading the book and doing this tool, how sometimes we have to start doing a bit of the opposite to almost get where we want. And there are, of course, saying that if you continue doing what you have been doing all these years, you will reach to a similar goal. And if you want change, you need to also change your behavior. And so this book provides that other perspective, or that other side that we can also start implementing.
Exactly.
So I guess for the audience, the book does have a lot of this information. For fun, you can also put it in ChatGPT and try to get some idea of what type of answers or how it helps you navigate it. However, Philippe, as you mentioned, the challenge with this assessment is that it's not a balancing act, it's a leverage act. So I don't know if you want to explain that a little bit here.
Yes, I was impressed, Claudia, if I can share, you completed the COF assessment. By the way, the COF assessment, when you get your report, it doesn't come with a prescription. It doesn't tell you, okay, Claudia, these are your results, this is who you are, and this is what you should do. It doesn't come with a prescription. For me, the goal here is the results don't matter per se. The results are only a starting point for reflection And for coaching, and you can do this on your own, reflecting, maybe using the book to help you in your reflection. You could do this with a peer, a colleague, or with a COF certified coach. The value is in that reflection, is in that conversation, more than in the results per se. This being said, Claudia, what you did was to ask ChatGPT to interpret your results. And not only that, but to also propose some good coaching questions. I have to say I was impressed with what ChatGPT was able to come up with in terms of analyzing your result. Already a lot of good points. There were a lot of good coaching questions to consider in what ChatGPT produced. There were two issues, though, two limitations. One is that it's as if ChatGPT hadn't picked up on the fact that in this assessment, we are not only looking at preferences, we are also looking at abilities. If I can compare this with the MBTI, I assume many of our listeners are familiar with a tool like the MBTI. The MBTI looks at psychological preferences, personality preferences. Are you more of an extrovert, more of an introvert, judging versus perceiving? And so the tool doesn't give you information about your abilities. For example, you can be an extrovert, but a shy extrovert. So you get your energy from interacting with people, but that doesn't mean you are necessarily good at interacting with people. Conversely, you could be an introvert, quite at ease with people, but what makes you an introvert is that at the end of the day, you are exhausted. You just want to be on your own. You don't want to be with people anymore. I'm just simplifying a little bit, but you get the idea. In the COF, you have on the left-hand side of the report information about your preference. But on the right-hand side, you have information that doesn't exist in the MBTI, which is about your competence. It's a self-assessment with all the limitations associated with it, but it's a good starting point. I can, for example, have a preference for direct communication, and I can also be good at direct communication. I'm able to confront people. But even though I have a preference for direct communication, I could also be good at indirect communication. I may have learned to use metaphors, to be very sensitive in how I communicate, to use intermediaries, to use all sorts of mechanisms to convey a message without offending the person, indirect form of communications. On the other hand, I may prefer direct communication and be very bad at indirect communication. If I don't have the information about my abilities, something is going to be missing. And apparently in the report you showed me, Claudia, the ability part was not considered at all. ChatGPT would say, you will need to increase your flexibility. Not necessarily, because results on the left-hand side, your preference, there is no good or bad answer. But when you look at competencies, yes, there are good or bad answers. What you want is to be hopefully good in the areas that are going to matter for you. We cannot be perfect at everything, but what we want is to develop a capacity, a flexibility to be good for what matters. If I need to be able to communicate both directly and indirectly, if that's going to matter, I need to have that flexibility. ChatGPT didn't give you that information. The other thing was about this concept of leveraging versus balance. In many tools, what we hear about is we need to balance. You are direct, you need to balance that with indirectness. And again, this is a simplistic form of thinking, a zero-sum game, as if you have more of one, you necessarily need to have less of the other. We need to learn to think in a more complex fashion, to appreciate that we can have the cake and eat it too sometimes. So let me give the example of direct and indirect communication. If I'm able to convey a message with clarity, the content that I'm delivering is clear, and at the same time, I'm able to do this in a sensitive fashion, I have the best of both worlds. So that would be the leveraging of the tool. In fact, I may be able to achieve more, to get my message better across if I have sensitivity in how I deliver the message. So that's how I can get the best of both worlds. ChatGPT apparently is not trained yet to think in that complex fashion. So the advice that ChatGPT would give you is that you are leaning on one side, maybe you need to consider the other side as well. That was about it. So those are two limitations, but quite frankly, it's impressive. And I would be curious to see if you train ChatGPT or any AI to integrate these elements of leveraging differences, considering abilities, what it could produce. I'm sure it will improve over time. I'm less convinced about the ability to replace a human being, though. to have that discussion with you.
Yeah. If you are going to try the ChatGPT route, I feel obliged to remind you that, of course, everything you put out there stays in the realm. So you can't remove that data. So you can remove your name from the assessment, and also that it's yours and nobody else's. So that data is yours too. But yeah, play with the prompts to try and see if you can manage to have it include this leveraging versus balancing. In my case, because in the challenges I'm facing right now, I would benefit from balancing. I guess I didn't mind the balancing questions. But yeah, try to do it that way. In terms of validity and reliability, of course, when we're looking at any of these assessments, we care very much of, is it what we're getting? Is it valid? And is it reliable? And so it would be great to hear your exploration in terms of, does this assessment actually measure what it says it does? You've already explained to us a bit of how it's linked to theory, but a bit more detail around how it's linked to theory. Does it cover all relevant aspects about culture, or is there anything that we need to bear in mind that it doesn't cover? And if we use other, or if we look at people around, is it similar to what we will see, the behavior we'll see, or that other tools will say? If you could tell us a bit about validity first, and then we'll go on reliability.
All right. Yes. As you say, Claudia, there are several concepts of validity. So let's take a few. Construct validity. You mentioned about construct validity in particular. Does it measure what it says it measures? And I would say on this one, the answer is a very clear yes, for a simple reason. Is that the way the tool is built is quite transparent and straightforward. The questions being asked are directly related to the concept, as opposed to what many tools, you try to measure a certain concept and then you come up with some sort of behavioral equivalent. And so you're not asking about the concept directly, you ask about a behavioral equivalent. So again, if I look at extroversion, introversion, let me take the MBTI example. I'm not going to ask you, are you an extrovert? I'm going to try to describe in the assessment some example of what extroversion might look like behaviorally, and I'll ask you to respond to that question. All right. So one of the difficulty with this approach, with behavioral equivalent, is that it may work in one context, but not necessarily in another context. Let me tell you about one of the reasons I developed these tools is I remember I was in Singapore one day and I was using some other intercultural tool that had a lot of validation studies, but still my participants, several of them told me, I don't recognize myself in these results. This is not like me. I don't think I would have convinced them by telling them, this is like you, because I have 10 validation studies that I can show you that prove that this is valid. What was the problem? The problem is that inevitably it's not possible to examine a tool in all the possible cultural contexts. What you could have is a validation study that works in one particular context where the behavioral equivalent of a concept is indeed equivalent. So you have a certain concept and its behavioral equivalent, but now maybe in a different cultural context, that same behavior would not necessarily be connected to the concept. I don't know if I make sense here. Let me give an example. Extraversion, introversion again. You can be an extrovert, but an Italian extrovert, I don't mean to stereotype, may behave different than a Norwegian extrovert or a Japanese extrovert. That's for the personality assessment. If we look at culture, it becomes even more complex to figure that out. So what I try to do is, instead of trying to come up with behavioral equivalent that somehow would work across all contexts, I think it's almost mission impossible. I came up with the idea of measuring the concept itself directly. And of course, it measures what it says it measures. And when people get their results, of course, it's them, because the question was asked very transparently. So that's good news. There is a downside to this, I have to confess. The downside is it's easy to fake your results. So the CO of assessment would not be appropriate if you have a reason not to be honest when you answer the questionnaire. Let's say I would not use the CO of assessment for selection purposes or to evaluate your performance. On the other hand, the COF assessment is really appropriate when there is no reason to be dishonest. For example, in the case of executive coaching, team coaching, the results are going to be confidential. So you have no reason to not be genuine, to not be candid when you answer that. When we do a cultural audit, your individual answers don't matter and will not be shared. What we are only looking at is the aggregate results. So again, there's a situation where there is no reason to not be candid. The COF assessment can only be used in those contexts, but in those contexts, yes, it is absolutely linked to the theory by the way it is constructed, and it, of course, measures what it says it is measuring.
And as you said, this is a very long answer. It could be a very long answer. So if any of the audience have questions about this, they can contact you afterwards. I don't know if you can touch quickly on reliability.
And also maybe on, I think you mentioned content validity.
Content validity and criterion validity.
By the way, I discussed this in my second book, Global Coaching, Methodological Consideration, on chapter 7. If you want to find out more, I discuss this in more detail in the book, these questions of validity and reliability. Does it cover all the relevant aspects of cultures? No, it doesn't, because culture is extremely vast. So it would be extremely pretentious to say that the COF is going to cover all aspects of cultures. However, with 17 dimensions in 7 categories, it covers more aspects than most of the tools that are typically looking at 4 or 5 dimensions. And in addition to that, I think what is unique about the COF assessment is that it gives you the option of adding more cultural dimensions. So let's say you are doing a cultural audit, for example, in the context of merger acquisitions between 2 companies, you want to compare the 2 cultures, and you are doing some interviews, and you figure that, it would be nice to have a dimension that addresses this particular aspect. In one instance, for example, I did this, and some of the people were talking about a culture that was more reflexive in nature. It was a case of an alliance between a Dutch company and a French company. And some people were saying, the Dutch were saying, I'm upset about the French. In this case, there were national differences, I have to admit. And they were saying the French, they always like to put things in context, to have a philosophical debate before taking action. And some of these Dutch people were a bit upset by that. Conversely, the French would say, these Dutch, they lack in sophistication. They just like to act, but they don't take the time to step back and reflect. An obvious dimension to it was reflexive versus active, or action versus reflection. And we did add that to the 17 dimension. That proved to be an interesting dimension to add. So the tool gives you that possibility. So although we cannot claim that it will cover all aspects of culture, we cover a quite wide range, and those 17 dimensions prove to cover many important aspects, and you have more dimensions as needed that you can add.
I guess we will go into more detail. As you said that story, it came to mind, how did you go about it and how did the coaching go? So another question that we have for today is, of course, what are the ways in which it can be applied? So maybe you can talk to us how it can be applied, and we go a bit more into detail.
Do you mind if I say something else about validity?
Sure.
Time is plentiful. You told me that time is plentiful. I don't want to bore the audience with this, but I think maybe it's important to say, because I think you also talked about criterion validity. If you do a cross-validation study, how does that work? I want to just refer to one particular study done by Céline Rojon and Helmut McDowell in the UK. What was interesting in their cross-validation study that established the validity of the COF, but also they found something interesting. And I'm just going to read out some of their conclusion because I think it's really interesting. It was concluded that, contrary to previous findings, classifying the countries into distinct cultural clusters cannot be justified on the basis of the present results, with differences between the cultures' profiles mostly being negligible. In that particular study, what they were able to show is that national differences mattered less than other forms of differences. In that particular study, gender difference seemed to have been more important. That's not to say that in other situations, national differences are going to be important and may be important, but in that particular case, it was an example where other differences were more important. The present findings support Rosinski's inclusive and dynamic view of culture, which stands in contrast with the classical binary and static view with its emphasis on categorizing individuals by their nationality. I just wanted to share this with you, a third form of validity. If I can say something about reliability, because you asked me about that, are results going to be the same over time? The answer is no. They shouldn't be, hopefully. Although change is typically not dramatic, we do see some changes. For example, in our abilities. Hopefully our abilities will become better, but also our cultural preferences may evolve over time, because if we are open to other influences, we may shift our beliefs. That's a good news.
I need to compare my assessment now that I've lived in 2 other countries. In the example you gave where gender, or in the research you gave where gender was a big difference, would then gender be the different culture?
Of course, gender, there's a biological difference with gender, but there are also culture associated with those differences, a more female or masculine culture and so on. And in that particular study, that seemed to be important. That's not to say that it's always going to be the most important. I just gave an example of working on an alliance between 2 companies. In that other example, national differences were more important. Gender difference did not matter that much. Sometimes generational differences will be what matters the most.
Is this concept of culture being any group and any cluster
Exactly.
of characteristics?
Yes. Applications.
Applications, yes.
All right. There are applications at different levels. The first level is the individual level, and I would say it starts with oneself, looking at my own cultural preferences. We need to be, particularly as coaches, we need to be culturally aware if we are going to coach other people, because if we don't have cultural awareness, it's going to be very difficult to coach other people, and including that dimension. So self-awareness, one-on-one coaching would be another aspect of leadership development, individual applications. Let's put it this way. Team development is a second area where this can be used. Then we have organizational development. And then finally, we have societal and even planetary development. If you want, we can zoom in on these different aspects, and maybe I can say something about the different area of applications. They are all connected and they are all important.
So maybe you can expand on the example you gave of this merger where you had the Dutch and the French, and that there was a difference in reflection. Can you tell us the coaching approach based once you had the results of the assessment?
Well, in that case, first of all, I was with a group of people. We acted as consultants, first of all, doing a cultural audit consisting in interviews and then using the COF to have a map of the similarities between the cultures and the differences. In that particular instance, I was asked to share these findings as well as the recommendations to the top management. I didn't come in as a coach. If I had come in as a coach saying, Mr. CEO, what do you think about those results? What would you do about this? I don't think it would have worked very well. They were just expecting me to just share the results and the recommendations. But then part of the recommendation was to coach mixed teams, people from both organizations working together. And what happened there was an opportunity to bring these people back together. We were already at a stage where each team had 2 leaders, one from the Dutch organization, one from the French, and sometimes they were upset at each other. They recognized that they shared the same goal, but there was just some cultural misunderstanding. And helping them to acquire vocabulary, to raise their awareness, allowed us to turn what they started to see as a personal problem, to turn that into a cultural misunderstanding that could be addressed. And the way we address that by simply training them on what is culture, what is the COF, looking at their personal profiles, and then discussing how they could best work together. And what, for example, they learned was to make the most on some of the differences. So how do you combine hierarchy and equality? How do you combine direct and indirect communication, for example? So that's what we worked on. And showing the results with graphic was instrumental in helping them to have those conversations, to discover those ways to make the most of the differences. It's also a case of sometimes recognizing that they have some common blind spots. For example, one blind spot, going back to the notion of time, was they were always pressed for time. And many people had confided in us that I wish we could not just have business meeting, but we could take the time to get to know our colleagues from this other organization. when I share this with the top management team, to their credit, they acted on this. And what they decided, let's organize a 2-day event. It's not going to be about work, but it's simply going to be about celebrating together and spending time together and building relationship together. The time that these people spent together was a good time, but also much regained later on because they got to know each other, start to build trust, and they were able to work more effectively together. But that implied, again, slowing down to take the time for that retreat. But conversely, when it comes to hierarchy equality, there were differences. And that was the case from learning from both perspectives. I can elaborate on that if you want, but I don't want to be too long. But you get the idea.
Yeah. So you wrote an article. You mentioned here, of course, through this work, what you are basically doing is helping them to work together, even though they're different. And one of the articles you wrote was about inclusion. And this is, of course, a very hot topic. So maybe you can also share something about this before ending the podcast.
Yes. Oftentimes, when we look at diversity and inclusion, the emphasis is on what I would call diversity 1.0, the demographic diversity. And that's, of course, very important. You want to make sure that in teams, in organization, everyone can be welcome, that people from the minorities, for example, are also welcome, that if it's a male environment, that women would also feel welcome, and so on and so forth. That's very important. Not just out of political correctness, but in a time when there is this war for talents, it would be unfortunate to not call upon talents from minorities and from groups that may not feel welcome in your organization. You may want to make sure that you call upon all the available talents and that there is no discrimination, no prejudice. Everyone can feel welcome. That's the basis. That's not enough, though, if you want to make the most of cultural differences and if you want to promote creativity, innovation, and performance in a team. For that, you need the 2.0 and 3.0. 2.0 is about cognitive diversity. People having different views, different cultural perspective, and being in a team, in an organization where that is welcome, when that is cultivated. There is several research findings I mentioned in my article. I've written a number of occasions about this that shows that when you are able to cultivate that diversity, you will have cognitive diversity, greater creativity, innovation, and performance. But how to do that? The intercultural coaching approach and using the COF gives us a practical way to do that. We would be looking at profiles, cultural profiles, and ensuring you are making the most of whatever difference appears, direct, indirect communication. For example, universalis, particularis, collaborative, competitive, and so on and so forth. So how can you capitalize on the differences? So that's 2.0. The 3.0 is a more unusual form of diversity and inclusion, is this notion that diversity is in us, but sometimes it is hidden, it is buried. And it is the role of the coach to unleash what may be hidden. Even though a team may look homogeneous, for example, I've seen teams that all believe in equality. And that's great. They all believe in equality, but they end up being very collaborative in the sense that everybody has a say, everybody participates, but sometimes they have a difficulty reaching decisions. So when there is a conflict, to arbitrate that conflict because nobody takes the lead there. What happens then, it may be interesting to take a more hierarchical approach, a more directive stance. And once the team recognizes that, they can continue to have a climate where everybody has a say and so on. And at the same time, accept that it makes sense at some point to have somebody taking the lead and being more directive. And in other words, they are able to unleash the hierarchical culture that is in them, buried in them. We all have all these cultural capacities in us. What happens is that we have been raised in a certain context where those capacities perhaps were not used, were not evoked. If I'm born in a certain context, I end up behaving a certain way. But if I was born in a different context, maybe other preferences, other capacity would have been developed. The good news is our brain is quite plastic and we have the ability to continue to grow and develop these cultural capacities in us. So that's the diversity and inclusion 3.0 is yes, demographic diversity, but also internal and implicit diversity. If we can unleash all that, we can have a fantastic situation of really making the most of cultural differences in the broader sense. That, I have to say, is not the common understanding of diversity and inclusion today, but that's what I hope will be the understanding of diversity and inclusion in the future, because that's where the real benefits can come from.
And this brings us back to our first episode, which is on awareness and how having this awareness, as you going from unconscious incompetence to bringing that into awareness and going to conscious competence, how it helps us in our journey towards development and to inclusion when we have diversity. Is there anything else you want to share with the audience before we close the episode?
There is a lot more to be shared, but thank you, Claudia, for inviting me to this podcast. Thank you all for listening today. I'm available if you have more questions to ask. Feel free to connect with me via LinkedIn, for example. That would be a good way to connect. I invite you to do what Claudia has suggested. Try out that COF assessment, more information in my books, articles. And yes, and maybe if you want to learn more about this, there is also a certification seminar on the COF assessment. It may also be interesting to work with a COF certified coach if you want to explore this further, to discover cultural avenues. I think it's important, maybe I will say this, as a coach, to integrate this dimension into our practice. And I see sometimes coaches, yes, they know something about culture, but they are not including that dimension systematically in coaching. I think that is a problem, because if we are not aware of our cultural preferences, we might inadvertently push our worldview onto others. If I believe in control, I may inadvertently push others beyond their limitations. And that's, again, the example I have given, but that applies to other dimensions as well. So to avoid that trap, I think as coaches and also as supervisors, we need to learn about this. And this requires some effort, but also it's exciting because there is real joy in learning from others, from other cultures. And this is a lifelong journey.
Thank you for accompanying us today and for sharing with us more about culture. And we'll have additional notes from the episode in case you want to see where to read more about and to contact Philippe. Thanks again, Philippe.
Thank you, Claudia.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make sustainable differences to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our website at associationforcoaching.com. Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, member benefit interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events featuring thought leadership tools, models, and the latest industry trends to help you develop your coaching experience.